What's up, guys? I'm your host, Xavier Audick. Welcome to another episode of Inside You, and we are here today to recap Week 10 of college football. Another huge week for college football. A lot to get into, so let's start out first things first. Obviously, the biggest game of probably the college football year to start, Alabama taking on LSU. Alabama shutting out the Tigers. Final score there, 29-0. Very impressive performance by LSU. What struck me the most about this game is that obviously there's been a lot of talk about Tua Tagovailoa, more importantly how Alabama's secondary has been decimated by injuries, suspensions, the like. But what really stood out in this game was the play of Alabama's defensive line. They really manhandled the Tigers' offensive line for most of the game, holding the Tigers to only 12 rushing yards the entire game. This is a Tigers offense that had looked awesome against the Georgia defense as well as the Miami defense earlier in the year. So for them to not only win, but in the way they did it, very, very impressive. Now, I will say a bit of a concern if you are a Crimson Tide fan regarding Tua Tagovailoa's knee following that very impressive run for a long touchdown, and I believe it was the third quarter. He came up a little bit limping after celebrating. He did go into the medical tent for about 30 seconds, came back out and did finish the game. But certainly, although we're being told things like his knee's fine, everything's fine, this has been the second time in the last few weeks where on a non-contact play, Tagovailoa has injured, or at least appeared to re-aggravate that injury. So we'll continue to monitor that. But obviously, following the win over the number 3 ranked team by the College Football Playoff Committee, Alabama is now my number 1 ranked team in the country. Looking at their schedule going forward, they've got Mississippi State this weekend, and then Auburn. Certainly Mississippi State, I think people thought going into the season would be more of a challenge, but they, as good as they have looked recently, I don't think they'll be a real challenge for the Clemson Tide. The real game, though, is that Iron Bowl. Auburn came off a nice victory today over Texas A&M. While they've struggled this year, they can still put a nice cap to their season with a win over their hated arch rival Crimson Tide. So that game obviously will have its usual implications on top of just simply bragging rights. But Alabama right now, my number 1 team in the country. Then at number 2, I've got Notre Dame. Notre Dame coming off a nice win over Northwestern, 31-21, the final score there. Really, we're beginning to see the versatility of Ian Book and Dexter Lawrence. Lawrence, remember, sat out the first 4 games of the season. However, ever since he's returned, the Notre Dame running game has really been going. Very impressive win there for the Irish. I've got them as my number 2 team in the country because of them not only being undefeated, but having a win over Michigan, my number 4 team. And more importantly, while it might not seem that way, Northwestern was the first team in the Big Ten West. They still are, matter of fact, given that this was a non-conference game. So that's very impressive. And also, as we always like to talk about, that gives the committee a comparison game, given that it looks like Northwestern will end up playing Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. So they are my number 2 team. Then at number 3, we've got Clemson coming off just a absolute domination over LSU. Final score there, 77-16, setting up a huge game this coming week against Boston College. That game likely to decide that side of the Atlantic Coast Conference. Continue to look very impressive ever since Trevor Lawrence took over. Obviously, though, Dabo Swinney's team, just looking at their schedule going forward, not a lot of opportunity for them to lose, even with him playing Boston College, which came off a victory over Virginia Tech, and then Duke, which came off a victory over Miami, and then obviously South Carolina to finish their season. Really no wiggle room for a loss that they pretty much have to win out, it looks like, just given how terrible most of the ACC has been this year. Then, at number 4, I've got Michigan. Michigan beat Penn State 42-7. Very impressive victory when you compare it to how much Ohio State struggled to beat the Nittany Lions. Certainly looking at the rest of their schedule, it looks like that the game, their annual rivalry game against Ohio State, will decide who goes to the Big Ten championship game from that side of the Big Ten. Looking like they're going to take on Northwestern, but it appears that they will probably end up running the table ahead of that game. So those are my top 4. Looking at it, if one of them I think were to lose, I think it would be Notre Dame. They have Florida State this week, which although the Seminoles have looked absolutely abhorrent this year, I think they could pull off the upset. And then looking at it, they also have after that Syracuse, a very good Syracuse team, obviously a team that tested Clemson. Going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. Dino Babers will probably have some stuff schemed up just specifically for that game. And then lastly, they finished the year with their annual rivalry game at USC. And I've said all along, I do think the Trojans could pull off the upset there. So, should be interesting to see how this plays out. But if none of these teams were to lose going forward, I think this is what our final 4 playoff teams will look like. So then at number 5, I've got Georgia. Georgia obviously winning today over Kentucky. They're going to the SEC championship game where they'll take on Alabama. Very impressive win, not just because of them clinching the SEC East, but more importantly, just how they were able to gash a very good, up until today, Kentucky defense, pretty much without even really needing Jake Fromm to use his arm. Elijah Holyfield, DeAndre Swift were able to get the job done there. Looking at the rest of their schedule, they do have Auburn, which I don't think they should sleep on. I know they have the Iron Bowl coming up, but the Tigers can beat them if they don't show up prepared. So definitely want to go in that game focusing on them. But they're my number 5 team, and they're really just right outside of that top 4, not by much. Also, speaking of teams that lost today, LSU, they were number 3 going into it, and they do have a very impressive resume. Obviously, with this being their second loss, they probably are out of the playoff picture, but there's still a lot of intrigue with that matchup, given that LSU beat Georgia. Georgia now is going to play Alabama, and remember, Auburn, which plays both of these teams, has a win over a Washington team, which still very well could win the Pac-12 North and Pac-12, depending on what happens in the Apple Cup to end the season. So, if you are an LSU fan and you are disappointed with the loss today, just think about how you may have had another shot at the Crimson Tide if this were an 8-team playoff. So, that moves us along to my number 6 team, West Virginia. I've got them taking a huge jump in the rankings following their 42-41 one-point victory over Texas. This is a Texas team that beat Oklahoma by 3 points a couple of weeks ago. They also have a win over a USC team, which very well could win the Pac-12 South and possibly even the Pac-12. Looking at the rest of their schedule, really, even although they do play an Oklahoma State team which just upset Texas last weekend, it's going to come down to that Oklahoma game at home to finish the season. Could very well be a preview of the Big 12 championship, assuming these two teams win out. And if you are a fan of the Big 12 right now, your playoff hopes rest entirely with West Virginia and Oklahoma, and you're going to probably need some help. So, then at number 7, Washington State. Gardner Minshew continues to get the job done. A close victory over Cal, 19-13 the final score. The Cougars doing it with a late fourth quarter drive to seal the victory there. Looking at the rest of their schedule, they've got a Colorado team that has struggled recently, even though they did start 5-0. Then Arizona, I think that game will be a lot more difficult than most people expect. Khalil Tate finally looked like himself this last weekend. Should be interesting to see what happens there. And then obviously Washington in the Apple Cup. However, assuming the Cougars continue to win out, very well could find their way into the playoff discussion. But I do think probably the top of their ranking will be a number 5 ranking just because of the lack of impressive non-conference schedule. And then right behind them at number 8, I've got Oklahoma. They beat Texas Tech 51-46. Even with having changed defensive coordinators to Ruffin McNeil, the Sooners defense continued to struggle against the Red Raiders. Certainly, though, they were able to get the job done. Kyler Murray continues to impress. Now they've got Oklahoma State, Kansas, and then West Virginia. Similar to Washington State, I think the game before their last season game, that game against Kansas, could be more difficult than expected. Going to be interesting to see what happens here, though. But it looks like now the Big 12 will come down to either West Virginia and Oklahoma. And if you are the Big 12 commissioner, your biggest fear would be for the loser of that game to then win the Big 12 championship game a week later, because that very well would likely keep your conference out of the playoff. Then, at number 9, I have the Ohio State Buckeyes. Tougher than expected victory over Nebraska, 36-31 the final score there. But they were able to get the job done. Urban Meyer's team continues to only have one loss to a Pruger team. Looking at the rest of their schedule, they've got Michigan State, Maryland, and Michigan to end the season. That game right there between Michigan and them will likely be a matchup of top 10 teams. It'd be interesting to see how high Michigan is ranked when that game does take place. Very likely that the winner of their team finds their way into the playoff, regardless of if they both only have one loss at the time of that game. And then at number 10, I've got Central Florida. A tough game, 52-40 victory over Temple this last week. Definitely thought it was going to be a tough game, but McKenzie Milton and co. were able to get the job done, even if they did show some flaws in that game. Looking at the rest of their schedule, they've got Navy, Cincinnati, and South Florida. South Florida certainly had a lot of hype behind them until this last weekend. They were absolutely dominated by Tulane. Certainly looking like Central Florida runs the table. And speaking of the group of 5, with Houston's loss to SMU today, it very much looks like UCF will be the team to represent the group of 5 in the New Year's Six Bowl. The other two contenders are Fresno State and Utah State. Fresno State, though, still has to travel to Boise State, and then they play San Diego State the week after. Very possible they get 2 losses there. And then Utah State finishes their season with a game against Boise. So, assuming the Golden Knights continue to win out, it looks like they will find their way into a New Year's Six Bowl for the second year in a row. Now, one thing I do want to discuss, going back to Alabama, and I think this is the intrigue with this Crimson Tide team, is let's say they finish the season 12-0, perfect record, but then they were able to lose to Georgia in a very close SEC championship game by just a couple of points, maybe even a field goal. Looking at the rest of their body of work, and if some help were to happen, let's say a 2-loss team like USC, which given the fact that Utah lost their starting quarterback Huntley to a collarbone injury, very well could end up winning that South. And then let's see a 2-loss team, whether it be Oklahoma or West Virginia, were to win the Big 12. And then let's say Notre Dame loses. I would have no trouble with a 1-loss Alabama team, even if that loss were to occur in the championship game, to find their way back into the playoff, because you really then could say that they were unequivocally better. Remember, you have to do the math of Auburn having the victory over Washington and then the assistance of 2 losses and who they lost to and when they lost. But again, very interesting to see if the SEC might be able to sneak 2 teams into the college football playoff for a second year in a row. So that's just my recap of today's games. Certainly, like I said, going into the weekend, very much a lot of clarity leaving this weekend and looking forward. But there's still a lot of football to play. As you know, being a college football fan, anything can happen any week, and it should be interesting to see what happens from here. So what do you guys think? Who are your 4 best teams in the country, and who do you have as that number 5 team? I'm your host, Xavier J. This is Inside You, the College Sports Podcast, signing out. Bye.